And in a week, essentially, Bitcoin privacy was killed. It's wild to think about that, but in 1 week, essentially, the US government was able to kill Bitcoin privacy, at least temporarily. And the test will be, are we willing to put aside this concept of Bitcoin is perfect, we don't need to change it, or we're too scared of the potential fallout of doing something wrong, and essentially just keep on course and build something that is surveilled, transparent, and fits into the existing legacy system because it doesn't act as freedom money. Without privacy, I don't think Bitcoin is freedom money. The solution really is...
All right, Seth, thank you for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I'm really looking forward to this. I think I know all the work that goes into creating a podcast and editing and producing, and part of me really enjoys getting to sit on this side of it and participate, but not have to do all of the legwork that goes to the behind the scenes. So I know we have some really, really good, interesting, involved, and nuanced topics to get into today. So I'm looking forward to it.
Cool. So let's kick off with, your name is Seth for Privacy. I was just wondering, what inspired you to go on this mission? Was there any singular event that really kicked it all off and made it your focus?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really interesting because I started out, my background is all cybersecurity. I had zero interest in personal privacy, really was actually a huge Google fanboy, had all of the smart home tech, was an early adopter and did a lot of testing for Google Home. It was something where I saw the benefits of smart homes, the benefits of Google and all the things that they could bring, and honestly loved it. But no part of me had ever thought, what are the downsides of this? Mm-hmm. And no one around me had ever mentioned like, hey, there are actually some things that you lose when you choose to take the convenience route. So for a long time, did not care at all. I actually got into cryptocurrency, first Bitcoin, and then some random shenanigans for a while until I stumbled on Monero. And this will all relate back to the privacy topic, I promise. But stumbled on Monero. I just liked it because at that point it was GPU mined, and I'm really kind of like a tech enthusiast. I just love testing out new things, building servers at home, building my own computers, that sort of thing. So I just thought it would be fun. Build a GPU mining rig, 6 GPUs, and just play around with it. But what I didn't expect was when I got into the community, again, just focused on mining, people just started to point out the issues not only with financial privacy, but broader personal privacy. And it was literally the first time in my life that I'd ever seen anyone talk about personal privacy. Like everyone has an innate sense of privacy. Like if you, the classic one is if you talk to somebody and say like, okay, you don't care about privacy or you think you have nothing to hide, like just go ahead and print out your bank statements for the last 12 months, give them over to me and we'll move on from there. Obviously no one's gonna do that. I wouldn't have either, but that was the first time I really had people starting to explain to me that the convenience that we're gaining through a lot of the technology, the social media platforms that we've gotten used to over the last 10, 15 years is really at the sacrifice of our data and at the sacrifice of our current and future privacy. Because this isn't just an impact today, but the data that's collected, even if it doesn't negatively impact you today, has a very long-term effect. And that really started a journey down the rabbit hole that both led me back to Bitcoin in better understanding the need for money that was widely accepted, had broad network effect, that could be used privately. But it also led me to start to finally take things seriously and really just kind of read deeply on the concept of personal privacy. The main book that really kind of opened my eyes was reading Snowden's book that he published. It's maybe 2016 or 2017. I can't remember the name off the top of my head, but reading that and starting to better understand how corporations and governments, specifically the US government, work hand in hand to essentially abuse the convenience that we opt into without us understanding what we're actually being up to it. So that ended up in an almost overnight ditching of all of my smart home equipment and starting to kind of wrestle with like, how far do I go? Do I go like cold turkey and drop everything, no mobile phone, or kind of where do I find that convenience line? That's always been a struggle, and I think will eternally be a struggle as we try to figure out like what conveniences do we have to have, what can we sacrifice to have better privacy and protect ourselves and those we love. But that really kind of started that journey for me.
And since 2017, when you got into this privacy focus, how has it been received? Do people seem more interested in this topic now, or Yeah,
I think the common trope is to say that like no one cares about personal privacy. And I think that was probably true maybe 10 to 15 years ago. There just wasn't even a communal sense of like that privacy is a thing that matters. Again, there's an innate sense, but it wasn't in the common discourse. There was nobody really talking about this outside of people that were viewed as crazy, like Edward Snowden, like Glenn Greenwald, people who were trying to break in and say like, hey, like there are major abuses happening. You need to think about this. But I really feel like even just since my time starting thinking about personal privacy, there's been a broad renaissance of thought where almost everyone you talk to actually cares about personal privacy and realizes the need. Now, that does not mean that people are actually taking actionable steps towards better personal privacy. Usually what that looks like is just, I know that I need privacy, it's too hard, so just I'll give up. And that's very unfortunate. But I think a really good way to kind of get a picture of how broad is this topic in society is to look at especially Apple's big marketing push over the last couple of years. And that they've shifted not only technologically to actually implementing some really cool privacy tech. I'm not going to give them a pass for everything, but they do have some really interesting things that they've implemented and made optional, at least for users of their platforms. But they have pushed a large portion of their advertising campaigns towards personal privacy being the focus of it. And no company is going to do that if no one actually cares about that. I mean, Apple is a massive, massive global company. And I think that's a good tell that there's been a shift over the last, really, I think 5 years, where people have started to think, like, I do actually need to care about this, and I need to find actionable ways that I can do something. Companies like Apple take advantage of that, some in good ways by actually building good privacy technology and making that available, some in bad ways by pretending that they care about privacy wholesale, while really they care about protecting you from third-party advertisers because they want to have a monopoly on advertisements to you. So I think there's a lot of ulterior motives there, but it's a good, I think, litmus test of the space as a whole.
And so in terms of just the lowest hanging fruit for personal privacy online, what are some things that average person could do to just clean up their footprint and add some more privacy?
Yeah, I think the three biggest ones, going from order of easiest to hardest, would be, first off, just switch the browser that you use. It can sound really daunting at first, but most people are using Google Chrome, the overwhelming majority of the world, unfortunately. And Google Chrome is an absolutely malicious data collection tool. There has been widely documented abuses of that, the power that Google has. They have massive reach within the entire web browser space, even if you're not using Google Chrome. And just shifting from something like Google Chrome to Firefox or Brave browser will give you a massive jump up in the privacy that you get. Because even though we do use apps quite frequently today, a lot of our browsing, especially on computers, still happens in a browser. A lot of things are just browser apps. They don't have their own standalone app. So you can gain a lot of really good personal privacy by just switching to something like Brave or Firefox. And that's really because by default, they block ads, they block trackers, they have a lot of protections against what's called fingerprinting, which is basically just a way that data collection companies and corporations can try to figure out who you are, even if you try to hide who you are. By seeing things like browser settings, window size, they'll use a lot of different little pieces of data and piece together who you are and track you even if you ask them not to track, even if you don't create an account, etc. So that I think is the first step that is actually very approachable. Switching to Brave or Firefox, they'll both guide you through the process of importing your bookmarks, your saved passwords, everything like that. Both have cross-device sync, which I know people get really comfortable with Google Chrome. Both exist on iOS and Android. There's not really any downside to switching to those. And honestly, it actually is a massive improvement in quality of life. I forget how heinous ads are on the internet because I'm just so used to using Brave and Firefox. And then like, I'll be helping a family member with something and I'll just be like, how do you live on an internet like this? It's just like every page is just covered in ads. So it's really a net benefit to quality of life and it's a net privacy benefit. The second approach that I think I would take is just start to think in a minimalistic framework. And it sounds kind of daunting or weird, but just start to think about what apps and services do I actually use. There's a real tendency today to just install everything that's thrown at you, leave it on your phone forever, whether you use it or not, and not even think about what are the ramifications of this, what's the data collection policies of this app, what does it have access to even when I'm not using it. And so starting to think about like, can I do, once I have a better browser, can I start doing a lot more things just in my browser? Not worry about having to install the separate app for this thing that I use twice a year, but rather just log into the web app, use it directly there. Or thinking about, do I even need this service at all? Can I just drop this, delete my account, move on? That has a massive impact on personal privacy. And again, I think it has a big quality of life impact as well. Not only does it mean that likely your phone's going to perform better, you'll have more storage to use for real things like pictures of family and friends, but it also helps you to clean up the barrage of emails that come into your inbox when you're much more cautious about what you're going to sign up for. The third one, I think, would be, it's kind of a combo of two things. Switch to an email provider that has much better privacy preserving practices and technology, someone like Proton or Tutanota. Proton's a really enticing one because they also have Proton Pass, which is a password manager. They have Proton aliases or simple login, which is a tool that you can use to create unique email aliases. You can think of it like a forwarding address for every service that you sign up for, so that if that service starts spamming you, they won't take you off their list. They sell their mailing list, and that starts getting used for malicious phishing or whatever. You can just disable the alias. You don't have to move on to a new email account. It's a much easier way to keep your inbox clean and protect yourself, while also protecting your pseudonymity online, I should say. So I think the pairing of those three, they're very approachable. They're not that hard to make the switch to. They do take time, take it step by step, but the pairing of those three really would have a massive outsized impact on your personal privacy, and it's something that anyone can do. There are obviously far more advanced steps that you can go, but I think starting simply, taking on one thing at a time, really is helpful.
Speaking of Proton Mail, they just integrated Bitcoin, right? So I'd love to get your review of this as a power user.
Yeah, I've been a Proton user and fan for a very long time. Like anything, you have to kind of take with a grain of salt as a company grows and adds more products. How does this fit into their existing suite? How does this fit into expectations? And the announcement of Proton Wallet was very interesting. I think there's a lot to like in that it makes using Bitcoin in a self-custodial way far more accessible. A lot of people are going to have access to Bitcoin that wouldn't have thought about it or wouldn't have done it because they don't want to have another app and have another backup and have to think about this or think about Bitcoin addresses. Whereas in Proton, if you have a Proton account, you can just create a wallet. It's waitlist right now, but eventually you'll just create a wallet, back up your seed phrase that guides you through the process. Send and receive Bitcoin regularly using Bitcoin addresses, or you can send and receive using email addresses, which is a good user experience improvement, I would say. Overall, they did a good job with implementing a very simple Bitcoin wallet into their offering. Good, clean user experience. It's something that I think is very approachable. The downsides, and this is something that I'm excited, I'm going to get to talk to Andy and their CEO next week for my own podcast, but it doesn't fit their overall offerings from a privacy perspective. So their tagline is private by default. And that's always been the driving force behind what they do, is that everything that they release, even if it's a competitor to Google, like they recently released collaborative docs. So you can create and edit docs between users in a fully privacy preserving end-to-end encrypted way that's not tracking your every move and selling your data. That's a powerful thing. And the default privacy is key because it means that no one has to opt into it. Even if you don't understand the need for personal privacy, but you switch to Proton because your family recommends it or you watch this podcast, you gain privacy in so many ways. Email, password manager, email aliases, docs, whatever kind of parts of their suite you use. But when it comes to their Bitcoin wallet, there's no native Bitcoin privacy functionality. And I don't want to rag on them because I know it's a V1. Like, this is the first time they've shipped it. They have said that they have some plans to iterate on it, maybe add things like coin control and Lightning in the future. But every other product that they've shipped, the moment you can use it, you have strong privacy guarantees. With the Bitcoin wallet, and this is just really due to the lack of privacy in Bitcoin itself, you have no ability to leverage any kind of privacy within the wallet. It is non-custodial, it's not KYC, so theoretically your identity is not tied to it, but if you're paying for Proton with a credit card, your identity is tied to it. And then you're also linking your email address to your on-chain activity for Proton and anyone who pays you as well. So obviously that link is not on-chain, only Proton has it. They're of course committed to not logging, and they have a long track record of proving that they don't log anything that happens. They do log user IP addresses, which is understandable as a company that has to exist in a law enforcement framework, unfortunately. But that's the biggest shortcoming for me, is that people will come to it with the expectation of this is Proton, so it's private by default. but they're actually not getting any privacy by default, which is scary for me because that's one of the easiest parts about recommending Proton to people, especially people who don't care about privacy, is I know they're not going to go through extra steps to enable privacy. Whereas you could maybe get by with something else and put on some extra tweaks and change it. If they use a Proton service, they're getting strong privacy by default. But that doesn't apply to the Bitcoin wallet, which worries me because their tagline continues to be private by default. They were pretty clear in blog posts. They don't really think that another cryptocurrency like Monero being more private matters, that the network effect of Bitcoin is far more important. And like I said, they have no clear plans for privacy tooling. There was some mentions on a GitHub repo that they've since removed that said that they were going to implement Samurai Wallet Whirlpool. Understandably, they've dropped that in the wake of the indictment. We're going to get into that a little bit. But that would have made it make a lot more sense if they implemented some kind of novel, very user-friendly implementation of Whirlpool that allowed you to, as soon as you receive funds, start getting privacy on those funds, make it really intuitive, as I know that they would and could do. That would have fit a lot better. But releasing something like this with no real plans towards how to make it more privacy preserving in the future is worrying because people's expectation won't match reality. And I don't think the documentation does a good enough job of explaining that your activity here is not nearly as private as anything else that you're doing in Proton's apps.
Mm-hmm. And so speaking about Bitcoin and privacy and making that more simple, a big step forward recently is silent payments, right? So could you explain what that is and the problem that it solves?
Yeah, absolutely. So silent payments are essentially a new address type for Bitcoin. The easiest way to explain it is it's an address that is static and it does not change. You don't need to rotate it. You can have one static, it's a very long address, but you can have one static address you send to everybody, you post on Twitter, whatever. And anyone who has a wallet that supports silent payments, which is another part of this topic, can pay you at that address. And there will be no on-chain link between that silent payment address and the on-chain address. The on-chain address will just look like a standard Taproot address. There won't be anything unique to give it away that it was paid to a silent payment address, much less your specific address. And it's really a powerful tool both for privacy. It doesn't solve everything with Bitcoin privacy. I think a lot of people, when it was first announced, were like, oh, okay, we did it. Like we're good now. We have silent payments. We don't need anything else. It solves that piece of how do I receive Bitcoin in a way that doesn't immediately link payments together. And previously it was either you run a server, like you run BTC Pay server or something, which is fantastic, but that's a big hurdle for people to get over, or you just post one single Bitcoin address. That means that anyone who just copies and pastes that into an Explorer gets to see every bit of activity coming in, going out, etc. So this is a really big improvement from a privacy perspective and a user experience perspective, because now we can do things like, if you want to accept donations as a developer in your GitHub README, you can just post a silent payment address. Anyone can pay that. You have privacy. No one can see the payments that are associated with that address. And you don't have to constantly update it or be worried about the privacy that goes with that. So it's very good from a receiver privacy perspective. And it also enables other things like Bitcoin usernames, where there's a recent Bitcoin improvement proposal, BIP 353, that lets you essentially use DNS to be able to point a username to payment methods. And the ideal two payment methods are silent payments and then Bolt 12 offers, which are a very similar tool, very different in how it's actually executed, but a very similar tool in that it's a reusable payment code that you can give out to anybody and they can pay you in a way that's privacy preserving. So pairing those together, you can have things like, I'm trying to think of what my username is now. I think it's just Seth at sethforprivacy.com. Anyone who has a wallet that supports silent payments or Bolt 12 and BIP 353 can just have that, and they can pay me in a privacy-preserving way. And it's very intuitive. People are used to like cash tags, they're used to Venmo usernames, used to PayPal usernames, and we can finally actually have a user experience that approaches that, but doesn't require giving up custody, which has been a shortcoming, especially on the Lightning side for quite a while. So it's very encouraging. It's much needed. But as I mentioned earlier, it doesn't solve everything, especially with on-chain privacy. Because when it comes to silent payments, it solves that little piece of how do I receive without directly linking receive transactions back together, but without having to every single time give out a new address to somebody. But what it doesn't prevent is someone who pays you can then see the payments that you make with that Bitcoin in the future. If someone wants to, they could essentially dust attack that silent payment address. They could send you small transactions and then see when you consolidate together all the other transactions that you've received, know that you're the same person that's received all of those, and so they can get visibility into it. So there's a lot still that has to happen around coin control to have better forward-looking privacy. there's a lot of need for something to replace Samurai Wallet Whirlpool or tools like it to gain forward-looking privacy that you don't get from this. But it is a huge step forward, and it's one of the rare privacy improvements that is also a user experience improvement, which is a massively powerful thing because it's much easier to actually get people to use when it's easier to use and they get privacy as a bonus, rather than just trying to sell something that's purely privacy-oriented but actually makes their lives more difficult.
Yeah. So will this become the industry standard? Will every wallet support this shortly?
I think so. I mean, it's very much early days. So the big thing that has to happen first is a lot of the behind-the-scenes SDKs for wallets that people build on top of, things like Bitcoin Dev Kit, BDK. Those need to implement silent payments for both sending and receiving before a lot of other wallets will actually support it. There is one wallet right now that supports silent payments on mobile that's called Cake Wallet. They have built their own node implementation. They were really the first to deploy this, and it's usable right now. It's definitely improving. It's very early, but there's a lot of work to do around building the standards that will make it easier for hardware wallets to support silent payments, software wallets, etc. But it's very clear already that there is a massive desire for this as soon as it's ready. I've had an anonymous donor give a lot of Bitcoin to provide bounties for people who want to implement silent payments within their wallets or within upstream development kits. There's a lot of passion behind this because, like I mentioned, it's a privacy improvement and user experience improvement, and it's something that even if you don't care about privacy, it just makes Bitcoin easier to use. You could think of now that instead of having a wallet that constantly gives you a new receive address and you have to explain to people like, why does my address change? Why do I have to get out a new one? Should my wallet give a new receive address every time I ask for one or only when it receives payments? You can move beyond all of the pain points of avoiding address reuse in Bitcoin that we've come to experience and understand as Bitcoiners, but that's extremely daunting to a new person who's new to Bitcoin. Now we can just say, this is your address.
Yeah.
You're done. Just like Ethereum has accounts, they just have one address, you send to that. It's much more intuitive and much more in line with what people expect from the modern kind of traditional finance system. So it really is a powerful step that I think it should become the default address scheme for everyone. It does add some complications in how scanning actually works, which we don't have to get into today, but it's actually also more privacy preserving from a wallet sync perspective once we are able to improve that and get the scanning server side more widely adopted as well.
Well, that's a giant step forward for privacy in Bitcoin, but this spring we had a big step back. So, of course, there's the Tornado Cash case, as well as Samurai. These were big in the news about 3 months ago, and now it's sort of simmered down, unfortunately. But yes, we need to continue talking about this. And so please give us the latest on these cases, where we're at with them. But before that, could you explain the difference between the two, between a mixer and a collaborative coin join, and just the benefits and cons of using either?
Now, I wanted to quickly interrupt today's interview to give a massive shout out to our lead sponsor, Rihno Bitcoin. Rihno is a Bitcoin banking solution that combines traditional financial services with the power of Bitcoin. Created by Bitcoiners for Bitcoiners, Rihno offers a range of different services. You can buy Bitcoin, you can sell Bitcoin, you can withdraw straight to cold storage, and you can even pay other people using the Bitcoin Lightning Network. You can also purchase gift cards with sats at the click of a button, and you can even connect a multi-signature setup to Casa, all by using the Rihno application. Additionally, you can even send cash globally to your family and friends using Rihno, and soon you'll be able to pay bills, borrow money against your Bitcoin, and even save Bitcoin for your retirement, all in the one seamless application. You guys can visit rhinobitcoin.com to download Rihno today and experience the future of Bitcoin banking.
For sure, yeah. So I think it's best to kind of separate Tornado Cash and Samurai Wallet into two different but very similar categories. And then there's a third category, which has historically been prosecuted by the US government, which is custodial mixers. And usually when we hear the term mixer, it's talking about a custodial mixer where you actually send them your Bitcoin, they take custody, and then they send you someone else's Bitcoin. That's long been prosecuted. That is, for better or worse, clearly illegal under US law. And that's been the previous entire precedent, is that the US government and the DOJ have gone after centralized custodial mixers, arrested people convicted of money laundering, etc. That makes reasonable sense within their legal framework. Again, I'm not going to say that that's right or wrong, but that makes sense within the existing legal framework. what seemed to be totally above board and approved by the US government, by the regulatory bodies that have input into this, like FinCEN and FATF, was that custody was the crux of the issue. If you were providing a privacy-preserving service that did not take custody of users' funds, you were not considered a service provider, and you didn't have to get people's ID to be able to use the service. You didn't have to take these extra steps because you never actually held their funds for them. And that was the understanding really since 2013, and the understanding that I think led to both Tornado Cash and Samurai Wallet being built in a way that the people running the service, and it's a little bit different in Tornado Cash's case, but the service itself essentially never had custody of user funds. And that was always a clear guideline, and the reason for that was both because it's just better. Obviously, you shouldn't give up custody of your Bitcoin or your Ethereum if at all possible, and since we can build tools that don't require giving up custody but allow you to gain privacy, that's obviously better anyways. But also from a regulatory perspective, that was, everyone thought, and I've talked to many lawyers about this, everyone thought that that was totally fine, and that essentially meant that you were able to provide the service, you were able to build these tools, and you were not liable for the things that were done with the tools. And then the little bit of distinction comes into play with Tornado Cash and Samurai Wallet. So Tornado Cash, for those who don't know, was a smart contract on Ethereum that provided essentially Zcash style privacy. It provided very, very strong privacy if used correctly. You would deposit funds into the smart contract, but you retained custody. You never gave up custody. You got essentially a new private key for those funds that you could use to then withdraw the funds later on. And when you withdrew the funds later on, there was no cryptographic link between the input and the output. It was not just obfuscated with other users, but rather there was absolutely no way to link an input between an output. Again, as long as you handled the output well, you didn't send it back to the same Ethereum account, things like that. But the other portion of Tornado Cash that was wildly different than Samurai Wallet was that it was completely decentralized. There was no way for the Tornado Cash developers to change the contract, to prevent users from using it, to implement a whitelist or KYC AML. It was literally impossible. So once they deployed the smart contract and they set the admin key to a null key, they had no ability to change it. So even if the government came to them and said, like, hey, you gotta shut this down, they can't. They would literally have to go to Ethereum validators and say, you need to roll back the code or just prevent any transaction from using the smart contract at all. So that had an extra protection, and that they couldn't even stop anything if they wanted to. That clearly wasn't enough. The US government and international governments first went after them with sanctions, and then they went after them with an indictment in August of last year. And that really set the tone. As soon as that happened, it was very clear that the US government did not care about custody. Custody was not the saving grace that we thought it was, and that they were going to go after non-custodial privacy-preserving tools. At the time, I thought it would be Wasabi Wallet, not Samurai Wallet first. It's Wasabi Wallet so much larger. But this is something that I talked about immediately after I was in Prague in October, gave a presentation on the fallout of this and what I expected. And then in April, as you mentioned, the indictment came out against Samurai Wallet. They were arrested. All their servers were seized, website was seized, etc. And the difference between Tornado Cash and Samurai Wallet is that Samurai Wallet was non-custodial, but they did run a centralized server that could censor users if they wanted to. It was different in functionality. So you could argue that it was a little bit more vulnerable from a regulatory perspective than Tornado Cash, but still seemed to be totally approved by FinCEN guidance, by FATF guidance, etc. But they were arrested and indicted and taken down. And the arguments in both cases are essentially that because you provided privacy that then criminals used, you are liable for all criminal action. For kind of the latest updates in the Tornado Cash case, there's two cases going on. There's one in the US against Roman Storm here. That case just got delayed until December, and there were some really encouraging comments made by the judge on that case. That seems like he at least somewhat understands the implications of saying that if someone creates code that someone else uses for evil things, they are liable even if they have no ability to prevent the usage of that code in that way. So we'll see what happens with that. Like I said, postponed until December. And then the Samurai Wallet case, both the developers or the co-founders of Samurai Wallet were arrested. They're out on bail right now. And so they're, I'm sure, under heavy monitoring. I think both are under house arrest. in the northeast of the U.S. They're pending their first real hearing, which will be September 10th. And that'll be the tell of really what direction this is going to take. It's easier for people to read an indictment and think that it's just the cause is lost, the government said all these things, and it's just going to happen. But they have a lot more freedom in an indictment than they do, obviously, in an actual court of law. So there's a lot of hope still that we can make a very strong case. There are fantastic people building a case around Samurai Wallet, writing amicus briefs. There's a great organization called the P2P Rights Fund, just p2prights.org, that are helping to raise money to support them as well. And there's a lot of really good effort around it. But there is a continuous need for us to keep this in the public view, to talk about it. Because it's much easier for a judge to make an insane ruling if there's no press and there's no one worrying about it. And they can just slot that into precedent and move forward with being able to oppress other privacy devs and activists in the future. But if we can, for all intents and purposes, raise holy hell and make it a lot harder for them to do this in the shadows, I think it can have an impact on the case for sure.
Yeah. And what would you say is at risk here? Like, what's a worst case scenario out of all this?
Yeah, I mean, so there's kind of like a realistic scenario and a worst case scenario. The realistic scenario is if this indictment is successful, if they're able to prosecute and get a sentence against the Samurai Wallet devs, it will mean that anyone building privacy technology around Bitcoin is at risk of immediate arrest and prosecution, because this will set the precedent to say that custody does not matter. Whitelists do not matter. It doesn't matter what you do to try to prevent users. It doesn't matter what you do to try to meet the guidance that you know. We will just say that anyone writing open source code that provides privacy to Bitcoin, if a criminal uses it, and the US government can even use it and claim that it's criminal activity, there's some real weirdness there. They can claim jurisdiction by having an agent in the US use it even if you're in another country and claim that it counts in the US. They would be able to very easily prosecute any sort of centralized privacy tool. It wouldn't necessarily affect things like PayJoin, things that don't require a central entity to actually act as a coordinator, but it would really be the death knell for any kind of app layer privacy in the Bitcoin space. Now, the worst case scenario, and what there are hints of, but they likely won't pursue at least for quite a while, is going after self-custody entirely. It's hard to tell. That's clearly not the focus of this indictment. But there's a clear scaremongering tactic going on right now. And in the same week that the Samurai indictment dropped, that the Tornado Cash response dropped, the FBI also dropped a warning that basically said, don't use any wallets that don't use KYC AML. Don't use any exchanges, servers, services, etc. And the clear optic push is everyone should be using a custodial KYC wallet if they want to use Bitcoin. If they do that, you're fine, you're above board, you're approved. But if you don't use that, you are essentially considered a criminal. Now, there's no precedent, there's no legislation that goes against that. But the glaring thing in the Samurai case is there is no precedent or law, seemingly, that they've broken. And so the government is trying to set precedent, to set legislation through prosecution, which is a terrifying outset, because if they're able to do this successfully, it means that even if there is no precedent or law against someone building a self-custodial wallet, if that self-custodial wallet is used for anything malicious by any user who does something that isn't approved by the US government, that they can then set new legislation by prosecuting the developers of an open source software wallet that is not custodial. So that is very much the worst case scenario. I wouldn't say that that's the thing that's going to happen, but that's a possibility, because the second and third order effects of the ruling in the Samurai Wallet case will be felt in the self-custodial wallet ecosystem. We've already felt them in the Lightning ecosystem, with Phoenix voluntarily pulling out of the US. That will only ramp up if this case goes poorly. That was just from an indictment, which means nothing. They can go free. The case could be a huge positive, but just from an indictment, we've had many different services and providers pull out of the US. So this could have massive effects in the short term just for privacy tools on Bitcoin, but in the long term, it could be used as a way to put leverage on open source developers and on people building non-custodial Bitcoin tools. Mm-hmm.
And just for people at home to help out, you said the P2P Rights Fund is a place you can donate to.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, p2prights.org. The Bitcoin Policy Institute is running that right now. It's being spun off as its own nonprofit, which should be done soon, but you can donate today, and funds will obviously be migrated over to the new nonprofit once it's done. They accept both. Because it's a nonprofit, you can donate and get a tax receipt and everything if you pay with fiat or Bitcoin, or if you want to make an anonymous donation, they do accept anonymous donations via Bitcoin as well. Obviously, you won't get the tax break, but that's a whole other conversation.
Yeah. Well as privacy, you've also been a loud voice when it comes to eCash. This has been very popular, of course, over the last couple of months as fees spiked in the spring around the halving, and people are seeing that Lightning may not be able to fulfill all the promises that we once thought it could. So now eCash is getting a lot of popularity, and people on Twitter and all over, they seem to really like it and think it's a great alternative. But you have some different opinions, and I'd love to pick your brain on that.
Yeah, I think it's hard to get into because there are definitely things to like in that, especially on like the cashew side. It's hard when talking about eCash too, because eCash is a very generic protocol, but there's two basic forms of it in the Bitcoin space. There's cashew, which is a single person running a mint that takes custody of everyone's Bitcoin and theoretically makes the transactions that they want to make. There's also Fedimint, which is a federation of people. It could be one person pretending to be multiple, but a federation of people who take custody of the Bitcoin and then make the transactions via Lightning that you want to make. Those have obviously very different security models, so it's hard to differentiate. But the overall focus of eCash to me, it feels like a two-pronged thing. Part of it is just that Bitcoin is very, very, very hard to build on right now. If you want to do anything more than simple transactions, it's very difficult. That needs to change. I would love to see covenants immediately in Bitcoin, because it would drastically improve what can actually be built on Bitcoin. Tools that can improve privacy, that can make self-custodial wallets easier, can make inheritance easier. But Bitcoin is very hard to build on right now. So if you're a brilliant developer and you want to build something, it's likely that you can't build it around Bitcoin unless it fits into the mold of a wallet or a service provider around Bitcoin. eCash changes that, because suddenly you can have something that's Bitcoin backed that then you can make programmable and do essentially whatever you want with. You have a lot more flexibility with it. And I think that's a lot of the draw from the developer side, is that it's a fantastic playground for what is possible when interacting with Bitcoin. Again, not really what's possible on Bitcoin, because eCash is not on Bitcoin. It's just someone taking your Bitcoin and doing things with eCash, which theoretically is an IOU, but it allows you to build things that wouldn't otherwise be possible in a way that is at least backed by Bitcoin. So I think there's a lot of understandable and good developer interest in it from that perspective. And all the developers I know who work on Fedimints, Cashew, they understand the trade-offs. They're very transparent about them. They don't shill this as a layer 2 for Bitcoin or a fix for Bitcoin privacy, etc. They understand the shortcomings, but it is just a really cool tool for them to play with. And I 100% understand that. I think the other area, and the one where I more draw issue, is that I think there's a lot of coping in the wake of the Samurai Wallet ruling, in the wake of Phoenix pulling out of the US, in the wake of it being very clear that the things that we thought would be okay on Bitcoin for at least a while longer, like privacy via an application or Lightning via LSPs, they're under direct attack by the US government. And they both are naturally centralized. So they are vulnerable to attack by the US government. And so I think for a lot of people, eCash is an easy way to cope with the loss of those, because you can just say, oh, well, okay, I'll give up the custody of my Bitcoin, but I'll be able to have good privacy from the custodian, because eCash is perfectly privacy preserving from the custodian internally. And I'll be able to use Lightning easily, because we will all collectively, everyone who uses this eCash Mint or this Fedimint, we will all collectively use the same Lightning service provider, and they'll make payments on our behalf. We'll give them eCash tokens. They make the Lightning payment. And from that perspective, again, it's understandable, but I think it's very short-sighted, because it's very much a Band-Aid fix. It doesn't fix any of the problems with Bitcoin, and eCash mints are inherently centralized. Fedimints can be a little bit more decentralized in that you can be geographically distributed, but it's one entity taking custody of all the Bitcoin. And as I said at the very outset of talking through the Samurai case, there's a clear precedent that centralized custodial mixers are, centralized custodial privacy preserving services are not allowed to exist in the US. and the US government will shut that down if it gets big enough. That's essentially what an e-cash mint is. Again, I do not think that that is valid. I don't think that they should be considered illegal, but I think that that is relatively clear from the regulation that we have and the precedents that we have. And so that makes it a very daunting case for anyone to actually run a mint. And that's the other flip side of the argument is this seems like a good short-term fix. And while it's very small, the government's not going to go after a cashew mint that has 3 users. Like, there's no point. But if it gets big enough, it will get shut down even quicker, I think, than Samurai Wallet, than Tornado Cash, because it's a much clearer breach of what the government thinks is valid and is a valid use case for Bitcoin. So it's easy to use in the short term, but it also distracts us from the long-term goal of building decentralized, privacy-preserving technology around Bitcoin that can actually survive an adversarial environment. eCash and eCash mints will not survive an adversarial environment. They are not built for that. They work fantastically in community custody, if we're talking like the global south, which is normally the pitch of more of the Fedimint side of things. They work fantastically for hackathons and other small events, like the cashew side of things normally is more focused on. But if you're talking about 1 million users using a eCash mint and replacing something like Wallet of Satoshi, it's not going to survive the test of time. And so I'm worried that we're diverting a massive amount of Bitcoin resources, of time that developers have, where I would argue probably the only thing more scarce than Bitcoin is the developer time that we actually have to build things on Bitcoin, because developers are very scarce and developers that love Bitcoin are even scarcer. And so every moment that we spend on something that I think is very, very trivial to shut down in the future by any sort of nation state is time that's lost that we could have been spent on something that would build a decentralized and resistant framework around Bitcoin that can provide privacy. So I don't know if that's a TLDR, that was pretty long, but that's kind of the initial thoughts that I have around why I have problems with it. And I love many of the people building the technology, like I said.
Yeah.
I've known Calais, who's building Cashew for many years, fantastic dude. I know and have met many of the people behind Fedimints, many of the original developers. They're really, really, really brilliant. They're amazing developers, and I love the work that they do, and I of course want them to be free to work on whatever they want. I don't want to be the one who tells them you shouldn't work on Cashew or you shouldn't work on eCash, because I don't see it as valuable. But I worry that as more and more influential people within the Bitcoin space talk about this in a way that makes it seem like it's a fix for all of these problems, it's often discussed as a layer 2, or that it can kind of act as a layer 2. It's often discussed like this is the solution to Lightning being hard, is we just use eCash. This is the solution to Bitcoin being non-private, you just use eCash, but misses the point of how vulnerable it is to any sort of adversarial environment. And then to the side, and I haven't even mentioned any of the risks of just losing funds. A mint operator who makes a mistake, all the funds are gone. A Fedimint who has issues with DNS, as we've already seen, can have issues very quickly where they lose funds or users aren't able to use the service. So there's the non-malicious loss of funds possibility. There's also the malicious rug pull, where a mint can get enough users, get enough Bitcoin, and then just steal the Bitcoin. There's no recourse. So it's I think a very, very massive can of worms that is not worth opening because of the clear issues that it has in my book.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you bringing those issues to light. I mean, very few people are speaking about that right now, so I think it is important that we do so. But moving forward and looking into the future, do you think the Bitcoin community as it is today has what it takes to put privacy at the forefront and find these solutions that will change Bitcoin for the better?
It's a great question, and it's one I've been doing a lot of soul searching about since the Samurai Wallet indictment. Because I think a lot of us, and I think I got caught up in it too, viewed Samurai Wallet and a lot of tooling that's similar as the solution, and forgot that the centralized nature of it made it very vulnerable. And in a week, essentially, Bitcoin privacy was killed. And it's wild to think about that, but in 1 week, essentially, the US government was able to kill Bitcoin privacy, at least temporarily. And the solutions to that are hard because you can't just build another Samurai Wallet. I mean, you could, and you could be anonymous, and you could do this, but it's going to be just as vulnerable. You are going to be targeted if it gets big enough. You're just going to keep reiterating the same cycle. And when Bitcoin makes it possible to easily spin something like that up, that's a lot of personal risk that obviously someone would have to take on to do that. The solution really is changing Bitcoin to make it more private. And that is a conversation that there has been no openness towards in really the past 4 years, I would say. I think there was a lot more openness, maybe more in like 2014, 2015. That was before I got into the space, but from what I've heard, speeches that I've seen, that sort of thing, there was a lot more openness to the concept of maybe we can change the base layer to make it more private by default, or maybe we can enable something that allows people to opt into very strong privacy. And there isn't much openness to that now, but that really has to be the discussion, because the only thing that they cannot shut down is Bitcoin as a consensus layer, Bitcoin as a protocol. And if we can have strong privacy available to people without having to use a centralized service, without having to use a specific app, being able to use Bitcoin natively but gain strong privacy, that's the future. And the test will be, are we willing to put aside this concept of Bitcoin is perfect, we don't need to change it, or we're too scared of the potential fallout of doing something wrong, and essentially just keep on course and build something that is surveilled, transparent, and fits into the existing legacy system because it doesn't act as freedom money. Without privacy, I don't think Bitcoin is freedom money. And that's what I think is quickly forgotten, is if you can stack it in a KYC'd account, that's great until the government says, hey, we know you have this Bitcoin, you need to give this to us, or we'll buy it from you for X amount, go full 6102 and take custody of everyone's Bitcoin. It's very easy to shut down Bitcoin if there's no private, or it's very easy to suppress the usage and adoption of Bitcoin if there's no privacy. Obviously, it's very hard to shut down the protocol, but it's much easier to break the social layer if there's no privacy. So I think there's going to have to be very hard discussions around, are we willing to implement something like hidden amounts within Bitcoin to provide strong privacy? Are we going to implement something like full chain membership proofs, which would allow you to prove that your input in a transaction is valid without revealing which input it is? You could make a Bitcoin transaction that is provably not creating funds, but do it without actually showing the input to the world. But it would still be verifiable, would still be able to be mined, validated by nodes, etc. Are we willing to do these things that have the very, very tiny potential to cause issues? They're very well reviewed, well understood cryptography. Or are we going to say that Bitcoin's good enough as is, we'll just try to fix it somewhere else? And I think if we go that route, Bitcoin will cease to function as freedom money. It might still be useful in specific instances. In some jurisdictions, it'll be more useful than others if there's less suppression or if the government is less capable of surveilling Bitcoin. But that's my concern. That's where I think a lot of the conversation has to shift to say, we can't just keep slapping Band-Aids on this. eCash is a Band-Aid fix. It works temporarily right now, but it's very easy to shut down. We need to think, how are we going to make Bitcoin in a decentralized fashion able to provide strong privacy to individuals who need it? In my ideal world, to everyone who uses Bitcoin, even if they don't realize the need for privacy, but I know that's probably too far of a hurdle to go through, but at least allowing people who understand the need for privacy to easily opt into something that provides strong privacy for sender, amount, and receiver.
Nice. And for people at home who want to learn more about privacy on their own, what are some good resources for them to look into?
Yeah, I think some really good ones for me. I have some writing about privacy on SethForPrivacy.com. I also have a podcast that I'm shortly revamping called Opt Out, where it's much more broadly privacy focused, and I try to make it very actionable. Another good site would be freedom.tech, which I make for a foundation. And it's a publication where we're trying to create guides, create journalistic content that helps you better understand the need for privacy, attacks on privacy, and tools that you can use to actually gain better privacy. So that's another one as well. There's a lot of different places to look. Another good one, a YouTube channel, is Techlore, Techlore. He makes fantastic, really approachable content. He's been a good friend for a long time as well. So there's a lot of stuff out there. I mean, honestly, if you understand the need for privacy and you start to grasp that, there are fantastic resources now, which is nice and is a real change from, I think, 10 years ago, that there's actually ways that you can learn quickly how to do these things. I think one resource that's especially useful, especially what we talked about earlier with like what are the kind of first actionable steps you can take for privacy, is I wrote up a blog post after talking to a lot of people about if I was to be able to do my privacy journey over and knowing what I do now, how would I approach it? What order would I do it in? What kinds of tools would I use? And I have a blog post called Privacy First Steps on my site, SethForPrivacy.com, that walks through that, links out, gives explanations of each thing. And I think is really helpful as a starting point to, you don't have to go in the order that I say, that's personal, and the order of how you approach it depends on how you threat model, which is a whole other topic. but it'll give you some good places to start and ideas around, like maybe I start with a browser, I link you out to everything you need there. Maybe I'm going to start with a VPN because I already use a good browser, etc. It helps you kind of tier through, walk through what step do I need to take next, and what can I start to take a bite out of personal privacy, because it's not something you can do overnight, but step by step, slowly but surely, it's something that's really achievable for anyone.
Well, I think you covered it all. Thanks a lot, Seth. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you so much for having me.